Margaret Ellison spent $140,000 on 128 acres in North Georgia that had been buried beneath kudzu for more than 20 years. The vines covered the fences, swallowed the barn, and climbed over nearly every tree. Neighbors said clearing the land would cost more than the farm was worth. Then Margaret arrived with 68 goats. People laughed, but after 3 years of fighting vines that kept growing back, she found 12 dying pecan trees and saw the beginning of something no one else could imagine. A cool autumn breeze drifted through the North Georgia mountains beneath a pale gray sky as mist settled over abandoned hills where tangled green vines had swallowed nearly everything in sight. Margaret Ellison was 35 years old when she stood outside the Fannin County Courthouse holding the deed to 128 acres that nearly everyone believed had lost all value. The paper in her hands represented $140,000, almost every dollar she had earned after more than a decade building a successful career in Atlanta's financial industry. Many people would have called the purchase reckless. Margaret quietly called it the first honest decision she had made in years. She was slightly above average height, with an athletic frame that came from hiking rather than gym routines. Her chestnut brown hair usually rested in a loose ponytail, and her calm blue eyes rarely revealed panic, even when she felt it deep inside. Long hours in office buildings had left her fair skin untouched by the sun, but there was a determination in her face that coworkers had often mistaken for stubbornness. In truth, Margaret had learned to hide fear behind patience. She had grown up in a family where every mistake seemed to become a lesson repeated for years. Her father had worked endless overtime to provide stability, while her mother believed security mattered more than dreams. Margaret respected both of them. Yet every promotion she accepted made her feel further away from the life she secretly wanted. For 15 years, she studied investment reports, evaluated business risks, and advised wealthy clients about where to place their money. She became remarkably good at calculating numbers, but somewhere along the way, she realized she had stopped calculating happiness. During business trips across Georgia, she often found herself slowing down whenever she passed old farms surrounded by rolling hills instead of city traffic. She imagined waking to birdsong instead of alarm clocks and measuring seasons by harvests instead of quarterly reports. When the neglected property appeared at a county auction, most investors ignored it after seeing the inspection photographs. Kudzu had covered nearly every visible structure. Thick vines climbed over broken fences, wrapped around utility poles, swallowed abandoned equipment, and stretched across hillsides like giant green blankets. Several collapsed sheds could barely be recognized beneath the vegetation. Local estimates suggested that clearing the land might cost more than buying it. That was exactly why Margaret kept reading. Old county records revealed something most bidders overlooked. Decades earlier, the property had supported a modest pecan orchard before financial problems forced the previous owners to abandon it. There was no guarantee anything valuable remained, but the soil surveys showed unusually fertile ground beneath the vines. Margaret understood risk better than most people in the auction room. She also understood that markets often ignored opportunities buried beneath appearances. The auction lasted less than 20 minutes. When the final bid settled at $140,000, the room became unusually quiet before scattered laughter spread across several rows. Among those watching was Walter Boone, a 63-year-old cattle rancher whose family had lived in Fannin County for generations. Walter was broad-shouldered, with weathered skin, thick gray eyebrows, rough hands marked by decades of repairing fences, and a neatly trimmed white beard that framed a face both intimidating and kind, depending on the situation. He believed deeply in honest work and respected anyone willing to endure hardship, but experience had also made him skeptical of outsiders arriving with expensive dreams. After surviving several devastating droughts and losing his youngest brother in a tractor accident years earlier, Walter trusted practical experience far more than optimistic plans. He stepped beside Margaret as people exited the courthouse. "You just bought yourself the most expensive weed patch in North Georgia," he said without malice. Margaret smiled politely. "Maybe." Walter looked toward the distant mountains before shaking his head. "I've watched 3 owners fail on that place. Folks have burned it, sprayed it, bulldozed it. Kudzu always comes back." Margaret thanked him for the warning. She genuinely appreciated honesty more than encouragement. 2 weeks later, the quiet mountain roads echoed with the sound of livestock trailers climbing toward the abandoned farm. Inside traveled 68 boar goats. The animals immediately attracted attention from neighboring properties. Their muscular white bodies, brown heads, curious golden eyes, and constant appetite made them impossible to ignore. They climbed fallen logs, balanced on rocks, and began nibbling fresh kudzu leaves within minutes of entering the temporary fenced paddocks. Neighbors gathered along the roadside. Some leaned against pickup trucks. Others folded their arms while quietly watching. The whispers soon became open laughter. She paid $140,000 and brought goats. Margaret heard nearly every comment. She pretended not to. Inside, however, hope quietly settled beside determination. She knew almost nothing about running a commercial farm. She had never repaired fencing before. She had never managed livestock through changing seasons. Every evening she studied grazing plans, soil reports, and weed management guides until midnight, before sleeping inside a small aging camper parked beside the broken barn. The silence felt enormous compared to Atlanta. So did the responsibility. On her third evening, she climbed a ridge overlooking the property just before sunset. From above, the farm appeared almost alive beneath endless waves of green kudzu stretching across hills, trees, abandoned fences, and forgotten paths. It looked impossible. Most people saw a place nature had already reclaimed. Margaret saw a place waiting for someone patient enough to begin, 1 acre at a time. Winter arrived earlier than Margaret expected, and the mountains surrounding her farm disappeared behind cold morning fog, while frost settled over the endless blanket of kudzu that still seemed untouched despite months of effort. The excitement that had carried her through the first weeks slowly gave way to reality. Every morning began before sunrise with feeding the goats, checking water troughs, repairing portable fencing, and studying the next section of land she hoped to reclaim. Every evening ended with aching muscles and the discouraging sight that much of the property still looked exactly as it had on the day she bought it. Kudzu did not surrender because someone worked hard. It demanded persistence that bordered on stubbornness. Friends from Atlanta occasionally called to ask how life on the farm was going. Margaret usually answered with optimism, but after hanging up, she often stared across the hills, wondering whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life. There were days when she missed warm offices, predictable paychecks, and weekends that did not involve repairing broken fence posts in freezing rain. Yet each time doubt crept into her thoughts, she reminded herself why she had left that life. She had not traded comfort for farming. She had traded certainty for purpose. Instead of hiring bulldozers to scrape away acres of vegetation, Margaret continued following the plan she had carefully developed during months of research before purchasing the property. She divided the land into dozens of small grazing paddocks using portable electric fencing. The goats stayed in each section only long enough to strip the kudzu leaves before being moved again. When fresh shoots appeared weeks later, the animals returned. The process repeated again and again. Margaret knew the vines stored enormous energy inside underground roots, and only repeated grazing over multiple growing seasons would slowly weaken them without destroying the valuable topsoil beneath. The progress was painfully slow. Some hillsides showed visible improvement within a year. Others looked almost unchanged. Several patches continued producing fresh vines despite being grazed repeatedly, forcing Margaret to accept that nature followed its own schedule rather than hers. Financial pressure became another challenge. Every roll of fencing wire, every veterinary bill, every replacement water tank forced Margaret to calculate expenses carefully. The money she had once saved while living in Atlanta disappeared much faster than she had imagined. Instead of borrowing more from the bank, she searched for another solution. Word gradually spread through neighboring counties that a woman with Boer goats was successfully controlling kudzu without heavy machinery. At first, local farmers laughed at the idea. A few months later, curiosity replaced amusement. The first phone call came from Thomas Caldwell, a 58-year-old cattle producer whose family owned nearly 300 acres along the Georgia-Tennessee border. Thomas was a tall, broad man with deeply tanned skin, silver hair hidden beneath an old baseball cap, and a thick reddish-gray beard that reflected decades spent outdoors. Quiet by nature and respected throughout the community, he had become especially cautious after losing large portions of pasture to invasive plants during several unusually wet seasons. He did not trust fashionable agricultural trends, but he respected practical results. "I heard your goats are eating what my tractors can't keep up with," he told Margaret. "They'll eat a lot," Margaret answered honestly, "but they won't perform miracles." Thomas appreciated the answer. 2 weeks later, Margaret transported part of her herd to his property under a short-term grazing agreement. The goats worked exactly as she had promised. They did not erase years of kudzu in a month, but they noticeably reduced fresh growth while preserving the soil beneath. Thomas recommended her to another landowner, then another. Before long, Margaret found herself balancing 2 responsibilities. During the week, she rotated grazing on neighboring farms, and every weekend she returned to continue reclaiming her own land. The workdays became longer than ever. Yet for the first time since buying the farm, income began flowing in instead of disappearing. She also started selling young boar breeding stock to small farms interested in vegetation management. Every healthy kid born on her property represented another opportunity to invest in fencing materials, water systems, seed for future pasture restoration, or repairs to the abandoned barn that still leaned slightly after years beneath creeping vines. Nearly 3 years passed this way. The changes remained almost invisible to anyone driving by the property, but Margaret noticed them. Small native grasses began returning where sunlight finally reached the ground. Wildflowers appeared in places that had been hidden for decades. Songbirds landed in open spaces that had once been smothered beneath tangled vines. One evening, Walter Boone stopped his pickup beside the entrance and quietly looked across a hillside that had slowly transformed from solid green kudzu into scattered patches mixed with healthy grass. He removed his hat, nodded once toward Margaret, and simply said, "I reckon those goats are earning their keep after all." Margaret smiled, exhausted but encouraged. She understood the hardest part was no longer convincing the county. It was believing that every small victory was leading toward something much larger, something she still could not see. The first warm days of spring painted the hillsides with fresh green, and for the first time in years, patches of sunlight reached parts of Margaret's farm that had once been hidden beneath an endless blanket of kudzu. Nearly 3 years had passed since Margaret Ellison first unlocked the rusted gate to her neglected property. Her hands had become rough from repairing fences, hauling water, and moving portable electric fencing across uneven hillsides. The woman who had once spent her days reviewing investment portfolios now measured progress by the number of acres where native grass could finally breathe again. The financial pressure had not disappeared, but the income from grazing contracts and boar-goat breeding had given her something far more valuable than comfort: time. One cool April morning, Margaret led several goats toward a steep hillside that had been among the worst sections of the entire property. The animals had grazed the same slope repeatedly for almost 2 years, before the thick kudzu vines finally began losing their grip. Fallen stems covered the ground like old ropes, while scattered patches of wildflowers slowly reclaimed the open spaces. As Margaret walked higher up the hill, carrying pruning shears and a notebook, something unusual caught her attention. Several large tree trunks stood in an uneven line across the slope. Unlike most trees nearby, their bark carried deep furrows that suggested considerable age. Their branches looked thin and neglected, with dead limbs extending awkwardly toward the sky. Yet clusters of fresh green leaves had emerged from several living limbs. Margaret stepped closer. She counted them once, then again. 12. Exactly 12 mature pecan trees. Each one looked exhausted after decades of competition with kudzu, but every tree showed unmistakable signs of life. New buds had formed along younger branches, and tiny leaves trembled gently in the mountain breeze. Margaret carefully brushed away vines that still wrapped around one trunk. The tree had survived, not because conditions had been favorable, but because it had refused to quit. She spent the remainder of the afternoon marking each tree with bright survey ribbon before recording their locations on a hand-drawn property map. Rather than feeling excited, she felt curious. Why would 12 mature pecan trees remain scattered across a farm where almost everything else had disappeared? Instead of making assumptions, Margaret searched for answers. A week later, she contacted the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Office, asking whether someone could evaluate the surviving trees and recommend whether they were worth saving. Several days afterward, Dr. Samuel Whitfield drove onto the property in an aging white pickup, carrying soil probes, measuring equipment, and several weathered field notebooks. Samuel was 49 years old, lean and slightly taller than average, with sun-browned skin earned from decades working in orchards rather than laboratories. His dark hair had begun turning silver around the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard softened an otherwise angular face. Calm, observant, and patient, he had spent more than 20 years helping farmers recover orchards damaged by storms, disease, and neglect. After watching his own family's peach farm fail during his youth because poor advice arrived too late, Samuel dedicated his career to giving landowners practical guidance before opportunities disappeared forever. He spent nearly an entire day walking the property. He examined leaves, measured trunk diameters, collected soil samples, and dug several shallow inspection holes, occasionally stopping to quietly write observations without saying much. Late that afternoon, the two stood beneath one of the surviving pecan trees overlooking the valley. Samuel finally closed his notebook. "You don't have 12 miracle trees," he said with a small smile. "You have 12 survivors." Margaret remained silent. Samuel pointed across the hillside where scattered open ground had begun replacing kudzu. County agricultural records show there used to be a small commercial pecan orchard here many years ago. Nothing large, just enough to provide supplemental income. When the previous owners ran into financial trouble, maintenance stopped. Kudzu took over, and eventually everyone assumed the orchard had died. He handed Margaret several soil test results. "The remarkable part isn't these trees," he said, tapping the report with one finger. "It's your soil." The samples revealed deep, well-drained ground with excellent mineral balance and conditions capable of supporting healthy pecan production if managed correctly. Years without intensive cultivation had preserved much of the natural soil structure beneath the invasive vines. Margaret slowly looked back toward the 12 aging trees. For 3 years, she had believed her goal was simply removing kudzu. Now she realized that had never been the destination. It had only been the beginning. That evening, as sunlight faded behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, Margaret remained sitting beneath the oldest pecan tree long after Dr. Whitfield had driven away. She imagined neat rows of young pecan trees stretching across the reclaimed hillsides. Not next season, not quickly, perhaps not even for many years, but for the first time since arriving in Fannin County, she could clearly see what the farm might become. She quietly folded the soil report, slipped it into her notebook, and made a promise to herself. She would not simply save 12 old trees. She would build an entirely new orchard around them. The gentle warmth of late spring spread across the reclaimed hillsides as rows of fresh soil stretched beneath a clear blue sky, replacing patches of kudzu that had once seemed impossible to defeat. The morning after making her decision beneath the 12 surviving pecan trees, Margaret stopped thinking about whether rebuilding an orchard was possible. Instead, she began asking a far more important question. How could she afford to do it without risking everything she had already fought to save? She still remembered the financial discipline that had shaped her former career, and although she now lived in muddy boots instead of business suits, one lesson had never left her. A dream built on debt could disappear as quickly as it was created. Rather than ordering hundreds of trees at once, Margaret designed a plan that matched both the land and her finances. She decided every acre reclaimed from kudzu would earn the right to receive new pecan trees. The farm itself would determine the pace of its own recovery. Dr. Whitfield helped her select improved grafted pecan varieties suited for North Georgia's climate. Unlike seedlings, grafted trees would produce more consistent nut quality and begin bearing much sooner. Before planting the first tree, Margaret spent weeks improving drainage, testing soil nutrition, installing protective tree tubes, and placing irrigation lines where young roots would need them most. Every detail mattered, because she knew replacing failed trees would cost both money and precious years. The first planting season felt almost ceremonial. Only 160 grafted pecan trees arrived. Neighbors who had expected hundreds laughed again. "That's all?" one man called from the roadside. Margaret simply smiled. She had learned that patience often looked like failure to people who only measured progress by speed. The 12 old pecan trees remained untouched except for careful pruning and health treatments. Margaret referred to them as her teachers. They reminded her daily that survival often depended more on endurance than perfection. While the orchard slowly expanded, the goats remained the true financial engine of the farm. Every spring brought new boar kids, many of which were sold to farmers beginning their own vegetation management projects. The grazing contracts also continued growing as more landowners discovered that repeated browsing could suppress kudzu without destroying valuable topsoil. Some weeks Margaret spent more time loading livestock trailers than working inside her own orchard. She accepted that reality. The goats were paying for the trees. Several years into the project, Margaret met another important partner. Diane Marsh was a 42-year-old owner of a regional agricultural nursery that specialized in fruit and nut trees throughout northern Georgia. She had shoulder-length dark blonde hair, usually tucked beneath a faded canvas hat, warm brown eyes that noticed details others overlooked, and lightly freckled skin from decades working outdoors. Calm, practical, and known for treating beginning farmers with the same respect as experienced growers, Diane had inherited the nursery from her parents after helping rebuild the family business following a devastating ice storm that destroyed thousands of young trees years earlier. That experience taught her never to promise quick success, only careful preparation. After walking through Margaret's property, Diane quietly examined the spacing between planting rows before nodding with approval. "You're planting slower than most people," she said. "I have to," Margaret answered. Diane smiled. "No." She looked toward the 12 old pecan trees standing proudly above the hillside. "You're planting smarter." From that season forward, Diane reserved some of the nursery's strongest grafted pecan trees for Margaret each year. Instead of purchasing enormous quantities at once, Margaret expanded the orchard one section at a time as reclaimed land became available. The pattern repeated year after year. Clear another hillside, improve the soil, install irrigation, plant another row, protect the trees, repeat. There were setbacks. Late frosts damaged tender shoots. Summer drought forced additional watering. Several young trees failed despite careful attention. Margaret replaced them without complaint. Experience had taught her that agriculture rewarded consistency rather than perfection. Eventually, the oldest grafted trees began producing their first meaningful pecan harvests. The crop was modest compared with established commercial orchards, but for Margaret, it represented something far greater than income. She still remembered standing in the courthouse years earlier while strangers laughed at her decision. Now she held the first sacks of marketable pecans grown on land those same people had declared worthless. The goats continued grazing reclaimed sections of the property, still generating dependable income through breeding and vegetation management services. Yet for the first time, another source of stability had emerged beside them. The orchard was beginning to support itself. As Margaret loaded the season's first pecan harvest into her pickup truck, she looked across the young rows stretching outward from the 12 ancient survivor trees. She realized she was no longer restoring someone else's forgotten farm. She was creating one that future generations would one day inherit. More than 2 decades later, the same hills that had once disappeared beneath endless kudzu now glowed with neat rows of mature pecan trees, as crisp autumn air carried the sound of laughter across a farm no one had believed could survive. Margaret Ellison often smiled whenever visitors asked which tree had made her wealthy. They always expected her to point toward the 12 ancient pecan trees standing proudly on the hillside. Instead, she usually looked across the hundreds of younger trees stretching far beyond them. They all did, she would quietly answer. By then, Margaret was in her late 50s. Fine lines had appeared around her bright blue eyes, and strands of silver mixed naturally with her chestnut hair, which she still tied into the same practical ponytail she had worn when arriving at the farm years earlier. Her hands remained rough from decades of outdoor work, and although success had brought financial security, it had never changed her daily routine. She still walked through the orchard every morning before sunrise, checking young trees, watching the changing leaves, and greeting the few boar goats that still grazed selected hillsides to keep invasive vegetation under control. They were no longer the center of the business, but Margaret refused to forget the animals that had made every later success possible. The farm itself had transformed beyond recognition. Hundreds of healthy grafted pecan trees now covered the rolling landscape where kudzu had once formed an unbroken sea of green. Wide grass lanes separated every planting row. Native wildflowers returned each spring, attracting bees and butterflies that had disappeared decades earlier. Songbirds nested throughout the orchard while the restored soil absorbed rainfall instead of washing downhill during storms. What had once looked abandoned now reflected years of patient stewardship. As harvest seasons became larger, Margaret invested carefully instead of expanding recklessly. She built a modest processing facility where pecans were cleaned, dried, cracked, and packaged before shipment. Nothing inside the building was extravagant. The equipment was selected for reliability rather than appearance, reflecting the same practical philosophy that had guided every decision since the day she bought the property. Next to the processing building stood a small farm market with wide wooden porches overlooking the orchard. Families from across Georgia visited during autumn to purchase fresh pecans, homemade baked goods, local honey, jams, and handcrafted products made by neighboring farms. Margaret intentionally invited nearby producers to sell alongside her because she never believed success became smaller when shared with others. Every October became the busiest season of the year. Visitors walked beneath colorful pecan trees carrying woven baskets, while children searched for freshly fallen nuts beneath leaves that covered the ground like golden blankets. Elderly couples returned year after year, telling younger family members they wanted to show them a place where patience had changed an entire landscape. One afternoon, a young reporter interviewed Margaret for a regional agricultural magazine. Her name was Sarah Collins, a 28-year-old journalist with shoulder-length black hair, thoughtful hazel eyes, and an easy smile that encouraged people to speak honestly. Curious by nature rather than sensational, Sarah had grown up on a small dairy farm before studying journalism because she wanted rural stories to be remembered instead of forgotten. She listened carefully while taking notes beneath the shade of the oldest pecan tree. Finally, she asked the question Margaret had heard countless times. When did you realize buying this farm had become the best investment of your life? Margaret looked toward the 12 surviving pecan trees that still stood quietly above the hillside. It wasn't when these trees survived, she answered. It wasn't when the orchard made money. It wasn't even when people stopped laughing. Sarah lowered her notebook. So when? Margaret smiled gently. The day I stopped trying to remove Kudzu and started trying to build something that would still matter after I was gone. Those words appeared in the magazine several weeks later and spread far beyond North Georgia. Yet the people who truly knew Margaret understood that her legacy had never been measured by newspaper articles or financial success. It was measured by the land itself. The 12 old pecan trees still remained exactly where she had first found them, carefully protected at the center of the orchard. Every employee, visitor, and family member learned their story before learning anything else about the farm. They were not preserved because they produced the largest harvest. They were preserved because they reminded everyone that hope can survive much longer than people expect. Years earlier, strangers had looked across 128 acres and seen only vines. Margaret Ellison had looked at the very same land and imagined an orchard that did not yet exist. That single decision transformed $140,000 into far more than financial success. It became a legacy of faith, patience, and vision that would continue growing long after the woman who first believed in an impossible farm had finished planting her final tree. Before you leave, remember this. Land doesn't change overnight, and neither does a life. The real transformation never happened in the soil. It happened in a woman who refused to let one bad season, one laughing neighbor, or one impossible-looking hillside decide what her future would be. Everyone else looked at those 128 acres and saw a lost cause. Margaret looked at the same dirt and saw 20 years of patient work she hadn't started yet. That's the part most people skip when they dream about starting something new. They want the orchard. They don't want the 3 years of goats, torn-up fencing, and hillsides that look exactly the same after months of effort. But every farmer watching this knows the truth. Nothing worth building shows up fast. The kudzu doesn't die because you worked hard for one season. It dies because you showed up for the 10th season after everyone else assumed you'd quit. If you're sitting on your own version of 128 acres of kudzu right now, a business that isn't profitable yet, a piece of land nobody believes in, a plan everybody around you thinks is a waste of money, this story is for you. The trees are usually still alive under there. You just haven't cleared enough ground to find them yet. If this story reminded you why you started, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what you're out there rebuilding. If you know someone grinding through their own slow season on a farm, a homestead, or a business that hasn't paid off yet, send them this video. And if you like real stories about the people who put in the unglamorous work before anybody was watching, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Keep clearing your ground. Keep showing up on the days nothing looks different. The orchard is closer than it looks. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next farm.